Before we start, don't forget to hit that like button. Our goal is to reach 500 likes on this video, and with your support, we can make it happen. Now, let's dive straight into the entire history of medieval Russia, Slavic tribes in the forests and rivers of the north. Picture this: a world of endless forests, mist rising from deep rivers, and wooden huts hidden between towering pines. The air is damp, heavy with the smell of wet soil and smoke from campfires. That was the northern Slavic homeland more than 1,000 years ago, a place where life was shaped not by stone cities or empires, but by rivers, forests, and survival. The Slavs weren't born in palaces or marble forums. They grew in small communities scattered across wetlands, meadows, and woods. Imagine rowing along a twisting river, the banks thick with reeds, and spotting clusters of wooden houses surrounded by fields of rye and millet. These rivers were more than scenery. They were lifelines. They gave food, water, and highways for trade, but also marked boundaries where tribes sometimes clashed. Life was rough, but deeply connected to nature. Forests provided wood for homes, boats, and defences, but they also held dangers, wolves, bears, and hostile neighbours. Every tree, every stream carried meaning. Slavic religion was alive in those woods, with spirits said to dwell in trees, stones, and rivers. People offered bread or beer to appease them, whispering prayers before setting out to hunt or fish. It wasn't an organized religion with temples at first, but a spiritual world woven into the daily rhythm of survival. The tribes weren't cut off from the world. Rivers like the Dnieper, Volkhov, and Vistula were their highways, carrying not just fish and furs but also new ideas, new tongues, and sometimes new threats. Viking longships came gliding in first as raiders, later as traders, and even family through intermarriage. Those same rivers would one day bring Christianity and kings, changing everything. But in those early days, the Slavs still prayed to old idols and forest spirits. Life centered on family and community. Picture a small village feast, bread, mead, roasted meat on the tables, songs and stories filling the night. Elders told tales of ancestors, and honor meant loyalty to kin. Harm one villager, and you faced the whole clan. Disputes weren't written in law books, but settled by councils of elders, who judged by custom and tradition. Yet change was on the horizon. As tribes spread south and east, they met Byzantines, steppe nomads, and later the Mongols. Those encounters would drag them into larger history. Still, in those forest days, survival was enough. From these beginnings grew nations. The ancestors of Russians, Poles, Czechs, and others all came from these northern tribes. The rivers that once carried furs and honey would later carry armies and missionaries. The forests that echoed with prayers to spirits would one day hold churches and fortresses. But the memory of those early roots never vanished. It shaped their culture for centuries to come. Remember when we'll later talk about the Mongol invasions? The resilience the Slavs showed then had roots here in this rough, close-to-nature life. They had learned to endure, to adapt, and to stick together. And when the time came, that spirit of survival would be tested like never before. So, the story of the Slavic tribes in their northern forests isn't just about huts and rivers. It's about the birth of a people, quietly shaping themselves in the shadows of the woods, preparing without knowing it to step into the great drama of medieval history, the birth of Kiev. Vikings become rulers of the Rus. Picture this: long wooden ships slicing through misty rivers, their carved dragon heads glaring forward, while oars dip in perfect rhythm. These aren't Russian men yet. They're Vikings, Norse adventurers, traders, and sometimes raiders sailing not across the open sea, but through the veins of Eastern Europe. And the strange part? These outsiders would lay the very foundations for what later becomes Russia and Ukraine. It all starts in the 9th century. The Slavic tribes living in the forests and along the rivers were strong farmers, hunters, and traders, but they couldn't stay united. Quarrels and outside threats kept breaking them apart. So, as one old chronicle tells it, they made a bold move. They invited outsiders to rule. "Our land is vast and rich," they supposedly said, "but there is no order in it. Come and reign over us." The ones who answered were the Varangians Vikings from the east. One of the first names tied to this story is Rurik. He and his band of Norse warriors came down from the north, took control of Novgorod, and laid the roots of the dynasty that would rule for centuries. The details of his tale may be half legend, but his name marked the beginning of Rus leadership. From there, Viking influence spread south, pulled by the promise of trade. Rivers were their highways. The Dnieper, Volkhov, and Dniester linked the cold Baltic Sea to the rich Black Sea. At the end of those routes stood Constantinople, Byzantium, with its gold, silk, and spices. Picture it. Blonde Norse traders stepping off longships, axes at their belts, bargaining in the crowded markets of the empire. This wasn't just raiding anymore, it was business. And it was big. That trade route made Kiev the prize. Sitting right on the Dnieper, it controlled tolls, wealth, and power. In 882, a Varangian prince named Oleg seized the city and declared it the mother of Rus cities. With that, Kiev became the heart of a new realm, Kievan Rus. But this wasn't just a simple takeover. The Vikings didn't remain outsiders forever. Over time, they blended with the local Slavs. Their language mixed, their customs merged, and their descendants stopped being Vikings in the northern sense and became something new, the Rus. This identity, half Scandinavian adventurer, half Slavic farmer, became the cultural root for future Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. It's a fascinating reminder of how identities are never fixed, but constantly shaped by contact and conflict. Of course, with power came challenges. Rival tribes resisted, neighboring powers like the Khazars pressed back, and Constantinople loomed as both trading partner and rival fortress. But the foundation was laid. A dynasty, a capital, and a people who were no longer just Norse wanderers. Kiev was now more than a city. It was a statement that these river kingdoms were here to stay. And remember, this is only the beginning. Later princes like Vladimir and Yaroslav would make Kiev shine even brighter, turning it into a center of religion, law, and culture. But none of that would have been possible without this first bold step, when Viking ships drifted down the rivers and their captains decided not just to trade, but to rule. Strange, isn't it? The birth of what we think of as medieval Russia began not with Slavic kings, but with Viking adventurers far from home, carving their destiny into a land that would one day dominate history. And trust me, the saga of what comes next only gets more dramatic. Conversion to Christianity. Vladimir's baptism and a new identity. Picture this: a wild prince, known more for his pagan idols and countless wives than for holiness, suddenly walking into a river with his army and walking out as the man who would forever change the fate of his people. That's not just a dramatic scene, It's the real story of Prince Vladimir of Kiev. One moment, he was a ruler, chasing power with fire and steel. The next, he was the man who baptized an entire nation, giving medieval Russia a new spiritual identity that still echoes today. So how did such a transformation even happen? Let's rewind. Vladimir was not born a saint. He was the son of Sviatoslav, a tough warrior prince, and he inherited the throne of Kiev in the late 10th century. At first, Vladimir followed the old idols with passion. Pagan temples were built, sacrifices were made, and his reputation for lust and violence was notorious. People whispered about his excesses. Yet, beneath that chaotic surface, there was a question gnawing at him. What would give his realm unity, strength, and lasting order? Pagan idols could not answer that. That's when, according to legend, envoys from different faiths came knocking. Islam, Judaism, Western Christianity, and Eastern Christianity each offered their vision, but it was the Byzantine tradition, with its splendor and majesty, that captured Vladimir's heart. His envoys reported back from Constantinople's Hagia Sophia saying, "We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth." Those words hit Vladimir like lightning. He wanted that beauty, that mystery, that divine power for his people. But it wasn't just aesthetics. There was politics too. Aligning with Byzantium meant more than adopting their rituals. It meant tying Kievan Rus to the most powerful empire of the time. The choice was strategic as much as it was spiritual. And so, in the year 988, Vladimir took the plunge literally. In Chersonesus, a Byzantine outpost in Crimea, he accepted baptism. The prince who once bowed before idols now bowed before the Christian idol. Then came the moment that defined his reign. The mass baptism in Kiev. Imagine the Dnieper River filled with men, women, and children, all stepping into the water at the command of their prince. It wasn't just a ritual. It was a collective rebirth. For the people of Rus, this was not just about faith, but about identity. From that day on, they were no longer pagans on the edge of Europe. They were part of the Christian world. Of course, change didn't happen overnight. Pagan practices lingered, old habits died hard, and resistance simmered in corners of the realm. But Vladimir pushed forward. Churches replaced temples. Priests arrived from Byzantium. And slowly the rhythms of Christian life, baptisms, weddings, feasts, and fasts became woven into everyday life. This shift would shape law, art, architecture, and even politics for centuries. And what about Vladimir himself? Those who knew him said baptism transformed him personally. The cruel, lustful prince softened. He reduced his wives, cared for the poor, and became known as Vladimir the Great. Now, was he perfect? Of course not. Old habits never vanish completely. But the change was so striking that medieval chroniclers portrayed it as almost miraculous. Looking back, it's hard to overstate the importance of that river baptism. It was the moment Kievan Rus gained a spiritual anchor. Without it, would later Tsars have claimed the mantle of Third Rome? Would Russia's art, cathedrals, and literature carry that same Byzantine flavor? Probably not. Remember when we talked earlier about the Mongol invasions and the struggles of later princes? Their resilience, their sense of destiny, was rooted in this identity shift. Vladimir's choice wasn't just about religion, it was about survival, power, and legacy. And so, one man's plunge into the waters of the Dnieper wasn't just about cleansing his sins, it was about washing an entire nation into history. From wild prince to holy ruler, Vladimir's baptism was the spark that lit the soul of medieval Russia, a flame that would burn, flicker, and sometimes nearly go out, but never disappear. The rise of Kiev as a medieval superpower. Imagine a city so powerful that merchants from Scandinavia, Byzantium, and even distant Persia all fought for the chance to trade there. A city where glittering churches stood tall over bustling markets, and princes ruled like kings over a land stretching farther than the eye could see. That was Kiev in the Middle Ages. A city few today realize once rivaled the greatest capitals of Europe. Hard to picture, right? But this is the story of how a settlement on the banks of the Dnieper River grew into a medieval superpower. It all begins with geography. Kiev sat perfectly placed on the great Dnieper trade route, the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Traders from the cold north, often Vikings known as Varangians, travelled downriver through forests and plains, heading straight toward the Black Sea and into the wealthy Byzantine Empire. Kiev became their stopover, their fortress, and eventually their headquarters. Think of it as the medieval version of a highway rest stop that turned into New York City. But it wasn't just about location. Leadership mattered too. The Varangian prince, Oleg, seized Kiev in the year 900 and made it his capital, famously declaring it the mother of Rus cities. Under Oleg, and later princes like Igor and Olga, Kiev became more than just a trading hub. It grew into a political and military center. The princes taxed trade, controlled routes, and built alliances. Slowly, they were shaping the foundation of Kievan Rus, the first great Slavic state. Olga deserves a special mention. After her husband Igor was killed, she ruled as regent for her young son. In a world where female rulers were rare, Olga made her mark with both ruthlessness and clever diplomacy. She brutally avenged her husband's death on the Drevlians, but she also travelled to Constantinople, where she was baptized into Christianity. That decision foreshadowed something huge, the Christianization of Rus under her grandson Vladimir, which I'll dive into later. By the time of Vladimir the Great, Kiev wasn't just a city, it was the beating heart of an empire. Vladimir expanded the realm, fortified the city, and famously chose Orthodox Christianity as the faith of his people after negotiating with multiple religions. His choice bound Kiev to Byzantium culturally and spiritually, filling the city with stunning churches, most famously the Church of the Tithes. Imagine walking through its golden domes, hearing Greek chants, and seeing icons shimmering in the candlelight. It must have felt like heaven on earth. Then came Yaroslav the Wise, who pushed Kiev's power to its peak. Under him, the city boasted schools, libraries, and the magnificent St. Sophia Cathedral, modelled after Constantinople's Hagia Sophia. He even wrote down laws in the Russkaya Pravda, creating one of Eastern Europe's earliest legal codes. Yaroslav married off his daughters to kings of France, Hungary, and Norway, weaving Kiev into the very fabric of European politics. At this moment, Kiev wasn't a provincial outpost. It was a true medieval superpower. But as you might guess, no empire lasts forever. After Yaroslav's death, internal rivalries between his sons and grandsons started tearing the state apart. The unity that had once made Kiev strong began to crumble, setting the stage for future invasions and struggles. That decline, of course, leads us into the Mongol storm that would later sweep across Rus, But that's a story for another time. For now, picture Kiev at its height. A city of gold domes shining in the sun, merchants speaking in a dozen languages, warriors guarding the river routes, and princes plotting dynasties that stretched across Europe. It was a world where Kiev mattered as much as London, Paris, or Constantinople, the proud mother of Rus cities, standing tall at the crossroads of East and West. And that's how a riverside outpost grew into a medieval superpower, Yaroslav the Wise and the golden age of Kievan Rus. Imagine a ruler so clever that people still called him the Wise nearly 1,000 years later. Not because he won every battle, not because he built the largest army, but because he understood something rarer: how to shape a kingdom into a thriving center of culture, law, and faith. That was Yaroslav, the man who turned Kievan Rus into a beacon of power and learning during its brightest age. Now, Yaroslav wasn't supposed to be the star of this story. He was one of many sons of Vladimir the Great, yes, the same Vladimir who Christianized Rus. When Vladimir died in the year 1015, the throne didn't fall neatly into one set of hands. Instead, it sparked bitter family rivalries. Yaroslav, ruling from Novgorod at the time, clashed with his brothers, most infamously Sviatopolk, who earned the grim nickname the Accursed after ordering the murder of his siblings Boris and Gleb. That bloody struggle wasn't just about personal ambition, it was about who would hold together a vast land stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Yaroslav eventually emerged victorious, and when he secured Kiev in the year 1019, he did more than claim power. He began reshaping it. Kiev wasn't just another medieval city. Under Yaroslav, it became the mother of Rus cities, glittering with new churches, libraries, and schools. He ordered the construction of the magnificent Saint Sophia Cathedral, inspired by the one in Constantinople, its golden domes, a symbol of both piety and prestige. Can you imagine how people must have felt, walking through doors carved with sacred images, stepping onto mosaic floors, their eyes drawn upward into a world of colour and light? For a society only recently baptized into Christianity, it must have felt like stepping into heaven itself. But Yaroslav wasn't just a builder of churches, he was a builder of laws. He introduced the first written legal code of the Rus, the Russkaya Pravda, literally Russian justice. For a land that had long relied on tribal customs and princely judgment, this was revolutionary. It gave structure to disputes over property, inheritance, and even crimes. It wasn't perfect punishment, often depended on your wealth and status, but it brought order to a society that could easily have splintered. Think about that. While much of Europe was still patching together feudal systems, Yaroslav was laying down a code of law that his successors would reference for centuries. He was also a strategist in diplomacy. Instead of waging endless wars to secure alliances, he married his children into Europe's most powerful royal families. His daughters became queens of France, Norway, and Hungary, while his sons governed strategically important regions within Rus. This web of dynastic marriages stretched from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, earning Kiev the nickname the City of Brides. If Vladimir had connected Rus spiritually to Byzantium, Yaroslav connected it politically to Europe. And yet, his reign wasn't just polished diplomacy and grand cathedrals. He still fought battles, especially against the Pechenegs, the nomadic steppe raiders who threatened Rus from the south. His final victory over them secured Kiev's stability for years to come. But what makes Yaroslav's story remarkable isn't the wars he fought. It's the balance he struck between sword and scripture, blood and book. Of course, no golden age lasts forever. After Yaroslav's death in the year 1054, his carefully crafted balance began to unravel. His sons quarreled, just as he had with his own brothers. The unity he tried to secure fractured into rival principalities, opening the door for future threats, including the Mongol invasion centuries later. Remember when we'll talk about that devastation? You'll see how different it feels compared to this high point of pride and stability. Still, for a moment in time, Kievan Rus, under Yaroslav, stood as one of Europe's great powers, literate, law-bound, and connected to both East and West. His legacy wasn't just stone walls or royal marriages, but the idea that wisdom could be a ruler's greatest weapon, and in that, Yaroslav truly lived up to his name. Family feuds. Princes divide the realm into fragments. Imagine a family dinner that ends not with hugs but with swords being drawn. That was medieval Rus. A land once united under powerful rulers soon splintered into fragments, each piece claimed by rival princes who happened to be brothers, cousins, or uncles. And instead of pulling together against outside threats, they spent their energy fighting each other, leaving the realm vulnerable. It all began with the idea of inheritance. Unlike the Roman emperors who often adopted heirs, the princes of Rus passed lands down like farm plots. A father's territory was divided among his sons, each expected to rule his own portion. At first, this sounded fair, but in practice, it was chaos. Imagine splitting a cake among siblings, only for each slice to keep shrinking with every generation. Soon, dozens of little principalities dotted the map, each led by a prince eager to prove himself. Take Kiev, once the shining center of Rus. As new heirs claimed lands, Kiev's authority weakened. The city still carried prestige, but its power was constantly challenged by ambitious princes from Novgorod, Suzdal, and other rising centers. One year, a prince might rule in Kiev, only to be overthrown by a relative the next. The throne became less a crown of stability and more a prize in an endless game of musical chairs. These quarrels weren't just family squabbles, they spilled into bloody wars. Brothers marched armies against brothers, burning villages, destroying crops, and leaving ordinary people caught in the crossfire. A peasant who pledged loyalty to one prince might find himself punished when another seized control. Families who only wanted to survive the seasons were forced to endure the fallout of princely pride. And yet, even in this mess, something unexpected happened. While constant feuding tore apart the unity of Rus, it also gave birth to strong regional identities. Novgorod grew into a powerful republic with its Vesh, or People's Assembly, shaping politics. Vladimir Suzdal became a cultural and political hub in the northeast. These regions began to develop their own distinct flavors, laying the groundwork for future nations. So, while fragmentation was a disaster in one sense, it was also an engine of diversity. Still, the costs were heavy. When foreign raiders appeared, Polovtsian nomads from the steppe. For example, the princes were often too busy fighting one another to unite. There were attempts, grand meetings where leaders swore oaths of brotherhood and promised cooperation, but as soon as the meeting ended, jealousy or ambition would spark another war. The cycle never stopped. This fracturing of Rus has echoes in later history. Remember when we'll get to the Mongol invasions? The ease with which the Mongols swept through wasn't just because they were fierce warriors. It was also because the princes of Rus couldn't stand together. Their family feuds had hollowed out the strength of the realm, leaving it divided and weak. Still, not all was gloom. In quieter times, princely courts became centers of culture. Chronicles were written, churches were built, and art flourished. The rivalry between regions sometimes sparked competition in beauty and piety as much as in war. But the question always loomed: what would happen when a truly powerful enemy arrived? Could these divided fragments hold their ground, or would the old family quarrels doom them all? In the end, the story of Rus during this era is a warning. A family united can build a realm. A family divided can tear it apart. And the forests and rivers that once nurtured the Slavic tribes now echoed with the clash of kin fighting kin, a tragic reminder that blood ties aren't always enough to keep a land whole. The coming of the steppe. Pechenegs, Cumans, and endless raids. Imagine living in a city like Kiev 1,000 years ago. The markets are full of merchants, the churches are rising higher, and the river trade is booming. Life feels settled, almost secure. But then, on the horizon, comes a dust cloud. Horses, hundreds of them, and with them the terrifying sound of steppe warriors riding fast and hard. For the people of Kievan Rus, this became a constant nightmare, the endless raids of the nomads from the steppe. The open grasslands stretching from the Black Sea deep into Central Asia were home to tribes who lived and fought on horseback. These were people shaped by the steppe itself wide. Open lands where speed and mobility were everything. The first to truly challenge the Rus were the Pechenegs. By the 10th century, these fierce horsemen began pushing westward, clashing with Byzantium and smashing into the borders of Rus. They were masters of hit-and-run warfare, appearing out of nowhere, burning villages, and vanishing before the slower armies of the Rus could react. For decades, the Pechenegs were a constant threat. Even grand princes like Vladimir the Great had to deal with them. In fact, Vladimir fought them multiple times, trying to keep trade routes open and protect his cities. But no matter how often the Rus beat them back, the Pechenegs always returned. They were like the tide, retreating for a moment only to surge back stronger. And it wasn't just raids sometimes. They laid full sieges. In the early 11th century, the Pechenegs surrounded Kiev itself, threatening to wipe it off the map. Imagine the terror inside those wooden walls, the fear that the city, the heart of Rus, could fall to men who seemed unstoppable on horseback. Eventually, the Pechenegs faded. They clashed with rivals, suffered defeats, and by the late 11th century, they were broken as a power. But peace did not come. As soon as one wave of steppe warriors ebbed, another crashed down. The Cumans, also called the Polovtsians, in the Rus chronicles took their place. If the Pechenegs were feared, the Cumans were dreaded even more. Swift, skilled archers, they could rain down arrows while galloping at full speed, their warriors moving like shadows across the grasslands. The Cumans didn't just raid. They became part of the political game. Sometimes, they allied with Rus princes, offering their warriors for a price, or for shared enemies. Other times, they were the enemies, burning towns and taking captives by the thousands. In fact, many Rus chronicles are filled with laments about raids, about children carried off into slavery, about crops destroyed, about the sense that no frontier was safe. For ordinary people, the word steppe meant fear. Yet, there's a twist here. The Cumans weren't just destroyers. They also became entangled in the lives of the Rus through marriages and trade. Princes sometimes married Cuman princesses to secure alliances. Goods and horses moved across borders. In a strange way, enemies could also be partners. Still, the threat never vanished. A quiet season could suddenly erupt into flames with one swift raid. This cycle, attack, alliance, betrayal, attack again, defined the relationship between the Rus and the steppe peoples for centuries. It drained resources, shattered stability, and kept the princes constantly on edge. But it also hardened them, forcing the Rus to adapt militarily and politically. When later, an even greater storm, the Mongols, came thundering out of Asia, the Rus were already familiar with the cruel rhythm of steppe warfare. So, when you think of Kievan Rus at its height, don't picture only golden domes and bustling markets. Picture watchmen scanning the horizon for dust clouds, mothers clutching their children when the alarm bells rang, and princes endlessly riding out to defend their fragile borders. The steppe never let them rest. The Pechenegs, the Cumans, they were a reminder that in this world, danger could appear at any moment, fast as the wind and merciless as fire. Because in the end, the story of Rus was never just about building cities and faith. It was about surviving the endless raids of the steppe, where the next attack always felt just over the horizon. The Mongol invasion. Cities burn in fire and ash. Imagine the sound first, the thunder of hooves rolling across endless steppe, a dark cloud of dust rising on the horizon, and with it, a terror unlike anything the people of Rus had ever seen. The Mongols came like a storm, swift and merciless, and when they left, entire cities were nothing but charred ruins, their people scattered or enslaved. This was not just a raid or a war. It was an apocalypse that reshaped the destiny of medieval Russia. It began in the early 13th century, when scouts brought word of strange horsemen moving west. At first, the princes of Rus dismissed it. Their world was already filled with rivalries and battles. Another raiding party didn't seem unusual. But then came the year 1240, when the Mongols descended with full force under Batu Khan, grandson of the great Genghis Khan. United under one banner, they were an unstoppable machine. The princes of Rus tried to resist, but their constant infighting left them weak. Remember when we talked about how divided they were after Vladimir's conversion? Those divisions never healed, and now they paid the price. The Mongols picked off their armies one by one. At the Battle of the Kalka River years earlier, the Rus had already tasted defeat, but they had not truly understood the scale of the threat. Now they did. City after city fell. Ryazan was the first to burn, its walls shattered and its people slaughtered. Then came Moscow, still a small town at the time, and then Vladimir, one of the great centers of Rus. Chronicles tell us of churches filled with people being set ablaze, of screams echoing through the night as fire devoured wood and stone alike. No city, no matter how proud or fortified, could stand against the Mongol onslaught. Kiev, the jewel of Rus, fell in 1240. Its golden domes toppled, its streets turned to rubble. The city that had once shone with the light of Christianity now smouldered in ash. But the Mongols were not just destroyers, they were conquerors with a system. Once a city was crushed, the survivors were forced to pay tribute, and so began what came to be called the Mongol Yoke. Every prince had to bow to the Khan, delivering taxes and pledges of loyalty. Those who resisted were made examples of their lands ravaged, their people enslaved. Yet those who submitted were allowed to rule as vassals, their thrones held only at the Khan's mercy. The impact went beyond politics. Trade routes shifted under Mongol control, linking Rus to the vast empire stretching from China to Europe. The Mongols demanded order, and their messengers could cross thousands of miles under the threat of death to any who hindered them. For Rus, it was a paradox, humiliation and destruction, yet also connection to a larger world. Still, the scars were deep. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of tribute and fear. The Orthodox Church, curiously, survived and even strengthened, as the Mongols often spared it in exchange for prayers and cooperation. Faith became a refuge in a time when worldly power had crumbled. Looking ahead, this invasion set the stage for new leaders to rise. Moscow, which had been a minor town, would slowly grow in importance precisely because of its role in collecting tribute for the Khan. Later, when princes like Dmitry Donskoy defied the Mongols, their victories carried enormous symbolic weight. But all of that was in the future. In the moment, what people saw was fire, blood, and ruin. So when you think of the Mongol invasion, don't just picture armies on horseback. Picture mothers clutching children as flames consumed their homes. Picture monks burying sacred icons in the earth to save them from looters. Picture the silence that followed after the screams died out. A silence heavy with ash. That silence would haunt Rus for centuries, shaping its soul with both grief and resilience. The Mongol yoke, tribute, terror, and survival under the Horde. Picture this. It's the 13th century, and the sound of hooves shakes the earth. Clouds of dust rise over the steppe as warriors with composite bows and iron discipline thunder toward the cities of Rus. For Kiev, Novgorod, and countless others, it wasn't just an invasion, it was the arrival of a storm unlike anything they had ever seen. The Mongols, led by the descendants of Genghis Khan, would leave behind fire, ashes, and something that would haunt Rus for more than 2 centuries. The Mongol yoke. The Mongol armies struck with terrifying speed. In 1237, they descended on Ryazan, burning it to the ground. One by one, the great cities fell. Kiev, the proud mother of Rus cities, was reduced to rubble in 1240. Chronicles tell of streets filled with corpses, churches looted, and survivors dragged into slavery. Imagine watching your world collapse overnight, knowing the strongest walls could not stop the Horde. That was the reality of Mongol conquest. But conquest was only the beginning. The Mongols didn't settle in Rus. They ruled from afar, demanding obedience and tribute. Princes who wanted to govern had to ride to the Horde's capital at Sarai on the lower Volga, bow low, and receive a patent called a yarlik, granting them authority. It was a system built on fear and humiliation. You could keep your throne, but only if you paid up. Tribute was heavy, and it wasn't just silver. It was grain, furs, livestock, and sometimes even people. Mongol tax collectors, often called baskaks, ensured nothing was missed. For ordinary folk, life meant constant fear not just of taxes, but of raids. Steppe warriors could appear without warning, punishing rebellion with massacres. It's no wonder chronicles describe the Mongols as idols' punishment. And yet, life didn't simply stop. Cities rebuilt, trade slowly revived, and even under the shadow of the Horde, Rus adapted. Some princes, like Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod, saw the wisdom of cooperation. Instead of resisting the Mongols, he paid tribute, gained their support, and used it to strengthen his own position. His careful diplomacy helped Novgorod survive when others burned. The Mongols themselves weren't just destroyers, they were organizers. Their postal relay system, their census taking, and their administrative practices left a mark on Rus. The idea of centralized authority, taxation, and autocratic power grew stronger under Mongol influence. Ironically, the very control meant to keep Rus down planted seeds that would later help Moscow rise. Still, the memory of terror lingered. Villages feared the sudden appearance of riders. Parents whispered warnings to children. Even princes who gained power under Mongol favor knew their fate could change with a single decision from the Khan. It was survival, not freedom. Over time, the balance began to shift. Moscow's princes, once minor players, grew skilled at working with the Horde. They collected tribute on behalf of the Mongols, growing rich and powerful in the process. This would eventually allow Moscow to challenge Mongol rule itself, a story for later when we reach the famous Great Stand on the Ugra River. But for more than 200 years, the Mongol yoke defined life in Rus. It was a time of fire and fear, of tribute wagons creaking down muddy roads, of princes kneeling in distant sarai, and of people learning how to endure. Survival under the Horde was harsh, but it taught lessons in resilience, adaptation, and patience, lessons that would shape the future of Russia itself. The Mongol yoke wasn't just about conquest. It was about living in the shadow of power, caught between terror and survival, until the day Rus was ready to rise again. Novgorod the Great, a republic in a sea of princes. Picture this. While most of medieval Europe was ruled by kings and princes, there was one city where merchants, farmers, and townsfolk gathered in a great square, raised their voices, and actually voted on the future of their land. That city was Novgorod, a place so unusual in its time that it stood as a republic, surrounded by monarchies. In a world of crowns and dynasties, Novgorod charted its own path. Novgorod's story begins long before it declared independence from princely power. It was already a vital trade hub, sitting on the crossroads between the Baltic and the Byzantine world. Furs, wax, honey, and even slaves flowed down the rivers southward, while silks, wine, and silver coins travelled northward. The Dnieper and the Volga connected Novgorod to nearly every corner of the known world. By the time Kiev was flourishing under Yaroslav the Wise, Novgorod had already carved out a reputation as a wealthy, bustling marketplace where different languages could be heard in the streets. But Novgorod wasn't content to remain just another outpost in the Kievan realm. When dynastic squabbles erupted after Yaroslav's death in the year 1054, Novgorod seized an opportunity. Instead of being ruled directly by a prince's iron hand, the city developed a system where the people, or at least the wealthier and more influential among them, had a say. They called it the Vesh, an assembly that rang the city bell to summon citizens to debate and decide. Can you imagine the sound of that bell echoing across the wooden streets, signaling that the fate of the city was about to be discussed? The Vecha didn't just pick policies, it chose its prince. That's what made Novgorod so different. Unlike other cities where a prince ruled by birthright, Novgorod treated him more like an employee. If he failed to defend the city's interests or overstepped his authority, he could be dismissed. This wasn't democracy in the modern sense. Ordinary peasants had little direct power, but it was a remarkable experiment in collective governance during the Middle Ages. And Novgorod's real power didn't lie with a single man, but with its merchant class and aristocracy. Trade was the lifeblood of the city, and wealthy boyars dominated the Vesh. They ensured Novgorod's connections with the Hanseatic League, that powerful northern European trading network, remained strong. The city exported its famed furs, particularly sable and squirrel, in exchange for salt, metals, and fine cloth. It was said that in Novgorod, money spoke louder than swords. Yet, despite this republic-like system, Novgorod was no utopia. Behind the ideals of shared power lurked constant tension between the rich and the poor, the merchants and the commoners, the church and the secular leaders. Still, the city's resilience was extraordinary. While Kiev faced raids from nomads and later crumbled under Mongol invasions, Novgorod maintained its independence for centuries. Remember when we'll get to the Mongols' overwhelming Rus? You'll see how Novgorod managed to escape destruction, partly through geography and partly through clever politics. The church also played a defining role in the city's identity. The Archbishop of Novgorod wasn't just a religious leader, but also a powerful political figure, often serving as a mediator between rival factions. The spiritual heart of the city, St. Sophia Cathedral, echoed the grandeur of Kiev's, but also symbolized Novgorod's own claim to importance. Walking inside, with its cool stone walls and flickering candlelight, townsfolk would have felt the weight of both faith and civic pride. Novgorod's independence, however, always carried a shadow. The surrounding princes, whether in Vladimir, Moscow, or elsewhere, looked hungrily at its wealth. Novgorod could hire armies, but its survival depended on balancing alliances and buying peace when necessary. For centuries, it worked, but that balancing act couldn't last forever. When we reach the rise of Moscow, you'll see how Novgorod's proud republic eventually fell under the shadow of a centralizing Tsar. But in its prime, Novgorod was nothing short of astonishing. A city where trade mattered more than bloodlines, where assemblies could ring a bell and decide their future, where connections stretched across Europe. In a sea of princes, Novgorod proved that another way of ruling was possible, and for hundreds of years it thrived. Alexander Nevsky, defender of the faith and northern frontiers. Picture a frozen river, the ice groaning under the weight of armored men. Across it, a clash erupts, steel against steel, shields splintering, war cries echoing in the cold air. At the center of this storm stands Alexander Nevsky, a young prince whose name would echo for centuries, not just as a warrior, but as a defender of faith and people in one of Rus's darkest times. Alexander was born in the early 13th century, an age when Rus was under relentless pressure. To the east, the Mongols loomed, their armies having crushed city after city. To the west, crusading knights from the Teutonic Order and Sweden pressed into northern lands, hungry for conquest and determined to spread Catholic Christianity. For Rus, survival itself hung by a thread. Into this chaos stepped Alexander, Prince of Novgorod, a city both wealthy and fiercely independent. From the start, Alexander proved himself more than just another noble. When Swedish forces attempted to land near the Neva River in 1240, Alexander rallied his men, striking swiftly and driving the invaders back. This victory earned him his famous title Nevsky of the Neva. He was only in his early 20s, yet he had already shown the strength and cunning that would make him a legend. But his greatest test came a few years later against the Teutonic Knights. These warriors, clad in heavy armor and driven by crusading zeal, pushed deep into Novgorod's lands. Their plan wasn't just conquest, they aimed to bring the Orthodox Slavs under Catholic control. For Alexander, this was more than politics. It was a battle for faith, culture, and independence. The decisive moment came in 1242 at the Battle on the Ice. On Lake Peipus, Alexander lured the heavily armoured knights onto frozen waters. As the fight raged, the ice began to crack beneath their weight, turning their strength into weakness. Alexander's lighter, more mobile forces cut them down, scattering an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. The image of knights sinking into icy depths burned itself into memory, a symbol of Rus's resilience against overwhelming odds. What made Alexander remarkable wasn't only his victories on the battlefield, it was his ability to balance threats. He recognized that outright resistance against the Mongols, with their sheer military power, would only bring ruin. Instead, he submitted to their overlordship when necessary, paying tribute but preserving Novgorod's autonomy. Some saw this as compromise, even betrayal, but Alexander understood the difference between a battle that could be won and a war that would destroy everything. By bending in one direction, he could stand firm in another. Through this strategy, he saved his people from destruction while protecting the Orthodox faith from Western crusaders. In a time when many princes let pride or rivalry drag them into reckless wars, Alexander showed a rare gift for choosing his battles wisely. His leadership preserved a core of Rus culture, faith, and identity at a moment when it could have been erased. Later generations looked back at Alexander as more than a prince. He became a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church, celebrated not just for his military genius, but for his devotion and protection of the faith. His story echoed through chronicles, songs, and eventually even films, turning him into a timeless figure of courage and wisdom. When we later reach the Mongol domination of Rus, remember Alexander's choices. His victories in the north were not just about land, but about ensuring that the Orthodox Slavic world would survive long enough to face the greater storms ahead. In his icy battles, both on rivers and frozen lakes, Alexander Nevsky carved out a legacy that defended not just borders, but the very soul of his people. The fall of Kiev and the rise of Moscow's ambition. Kiev once stood as the shining heart of Rus, its golden domes glinting in the sun, its markets buzzing with traders from every corner of the known world. But imagine walking those same streets in the mid-13th century, the grandeur fading, the stalls half empty, whispers of fear running through the crowd. Something was unraveling. The proud capital that had been called the mother of Rus cities was slipping into decline, and from its ashes, new powers were already stirring. The cracks in Kiev's strength began long before the final collapse. After the death of Yaroslav the Wise in the year 1054, the unity of Kievan Rus splintered. His sons and grandsons fought bitterly over succession, and instead of one powerful state, Rus became a patchwork of rival principalities. Kiev was still prestigious, but its princes found themselves constantly challenged by ambitious rulers in Novgorod, Vladimir, and other cities. Civil war became almost a tradition, weakening the land from within. Then came the hammer blow, the Mongols. Sweeping out of the east like a storm, they crushed city after city. In 1240, Kiev itself faced their fury. Chronicles describe the city in flames, its people slaughtered or carried away into captivity. The once mighty capital was reduced to smouldering ruins, a shadow of its former glory. It never truly recovered. Kiev remained important as a religious center, but politically and economically, its dominance was over. The age of Kiev had ended. But decline in one place often means opportunity in another. To the northeast, smaller towns and principalities began to rise. Among them was Moscow, a place hardly noticed at first. In the early days, it was just a modest settlement on the Moskva River, surrounded by forests and far from the steppe. That distance, though, turned out to be an advantage. While Kiev lay exposed to raids, Moscow's location offered protection and room to grow quietly. What truly set Moscow apart was its relationship with the Mongol overlords known as the Golden Horde. While many Rus princes resisted, often paying the price in blood, Moscow's rulers played a shrewder game. They cooperated, collected tribute on behalf of the Khans, and in return gained privileges and influence. It wasn't glorious, but it was effective. Moscow became the Khan's trusted partner, and that meant wealth and power steadily flowed into its hands. At the same time, Moscow's princes understood something vital: the importance of the Orthodox Church. As Kiev's political authority faded, the Church needed a new protector. Over time, the Church's center of gravity shifted northward, and Moscow became not just a political hub, but a spiritual one too. This marriage of religious and princely power gave Moscow a unique legitimacy, allowing its rulers to claim they were the true heirs of Rus tradition. By the 14th century, Moscow was no longer a minor player. It was ambitious, expanding its lands, absorbing neighbors, and positioning itself as the rallying point for all Rus peoples still under Mongol rule. The fall of Kiev had cleared the stage, and Moscow was stepping into the spotlight. Princes like Ivan I and Dmitry Donskoy began to craft the image of Moscow as the defender of Rus, the seed of a future state that would one day call itself Russia. So, while the ruins of Kiev stood as a reminder of what had been lost, in the forests to the north a new power was quietly growing, one that would shape the destiny of Eastern Europe for centuries. The story of Rus was shifting. The age of Kiev was over, and the age of Moscow had just begun. Ivan. Moneybag. Clever deals with the Golden Horde. Picture a prince walking into the Khan's camp, not with an army at his back, but with gifts, gold, and a sharp mind. While other rulers fought, rebelled, or were crushed under Mongol power, Ivan of Moscow, later nicknamed Moneybag, chose a different path. He didn't win battles with swords. He won them with coins, negotiations, and patience. And somehow, this quiet, calculating approach laid the foundation for Moscow's rise as the heart of Russia. Ivan became the Grand Prince of Moscow in the early 14th century, a time when the Mongol yoke still weighed heavily on Rus. Princes had to travel to the Horde to receive their authority, kneeling before the Khan to get a patent of rule. For most rulers, it was humiliating. But Ivan saw opportunity where others saw only shame. If he could become the Khan's most trusted tax collector, he could gather wealth and influence that no rival could match. And that's exactly what he did. Ivan secured the title of Grand Prince of Vladimir, which gave him the right to collect tribute from all the surrounding Rus lands on behalf of the Horde. Imagine it. Instead of each prince handing over silver directly, Ivan took the responsibility. He skimmed a portion for Moscow, kept the Khan satisfied with steady payments, and quietly built his own treasury. That's how the nickname Moneybag was born. Now, it wasn't just about money. Ivan used that wealth strategically. He bought land whenever he could. Villages, estates, entire towns, expanding Moscow's reach piece by piece. Other princes often spent their fortunes on armies or luxuries. Ivan invested his in Moscow's future, turning his city into a magnet for trade, artisans, and clergy. Over time, Moscow began to look less like a minor principality and more like a center of gravity. The Orthodox Church also played a big role. When the Metropolitan, the head of the Russian Church, moved his seat from Vladimir to Moscow, it was a huge win for Ivan. Suddenly, Moscow wasn't just a political hub, but also a spiritual one. Pilgrims, priests, and donations flowed in, further enriching the city. Ivan supported the church generously, knowing that spiritual authority and political power often walked hand in hand. Of course, not everyone admired his methods. To some, Ivan was a collaborator, too cozy with the Horde, too willing to bend the knee, but his rivals couldn't ignore the results. While cities like Tver fought against Mongol demands and were brutally punished, Moscow flourished under Ivan's careful diplomacy. When Tver rebelled in 1327, Ivan stood by the Horde, helped suppress the uprising, and in return received more privileges and land. Brutal? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. What's striking is how Ivan's style of leadership set Moscow apart. He avoided reckless wars that drained resources. He avoided open defiance that invited disaster. Instead, he played the long game, understanding that survival under Mongol rule meant bending without breaking. His patience, combined with relentless accumulation of wealth and land, created the base from which later rulers like Dmitry Donskoy and Ivan the Great could finally challenge the Horde directly. Think back to when we talked about the Mongol invasion, with cities burning and people enslaved. By the time of Ivan, Rus was still under that shadow, but the smoke was starting to clear. Through clever deals, Moscow became the city that would one day rally the rest of Rus to throw off the Mongol yoke. That outcome was still far in the future, but the seeds were planted in Ivan's quiet calculations. So when you hear Moneybag, don't imagine greed alone. Picture a man who turned tribute into leverage, who built alliances with coin instead of blood, and who transformed a small principality into the stepping stone for a new Russian identity. Ivan may not have swung a sword on the battlefield, but his clever bargains with the Golden Horde proved that sometimes the sharpest weapon of all is a full purse and the wisdom to use it. Moscow versus Tver, the struggle for Russian leadership. Imagine two brothers locked in a never-ending rivalry, both vying to be the head of the family. That's what Moscow and Tver were in the 14th century. Two ambitious principalities fighting for the same prize. Leadership over the fractured lands of Rus. The Mongol yoke still loomed large, but under its shadow a new question emerged. Who would be the one to unite the Rus under their banner? Tver started strong. Founded earlier than Moscow, it rose to prominence in the late 13th century. By the early 1400s, Tver's princes were wealthy, bold, and favoured by many boyars, the noble elite. They held the title of Grand Prince of Vladimir more than once, a title that carried immense prestige. For a time, it seemed Tver might be the one to lead Rus into a new era. But Moscow had advantages Tver could not match. Geography was one of them. Nestled along the upper Volga River, Moscow was surrounded by forests that served as natural defences. It wasn't on the front lines of steppe raids like southern cities, and its location made it a secure base for growth. Moscow also benefited from luck and shrewd leadership. The turning point came with the rise of Ivan I of Moscow, known as Kalita, or Moneybags. In the early 1400s, Ivan won the favour of the Mongol Khans. Instead of resisting the Horde, he cooperated. The Khan granted him the right to collect tribute from other Rus princes, a privilege that turned Moscow into the tax collector of the Mongols. This was more than money, it was power. By controlling the flow of tribute, Moscow grew richer and its princes gained leverage over their rivals. Tver, meanwhile, tried a different path. In 1327, the city rose in rebellion against Mongol authority. The uprising was brutally crushed, and the Horde punished Tver severely. That rebellion became a fatal mistake. While Tver was weakened, Moscow quietly gathered strength. Moscow's princes also mastered the art of marriage politics. They built alliances with neighboring principalities, slowly bringing more lands under their influence. The Orthodox Church, too, moved its seat to Moscow in the 1420s, giving the city spiritual authority in addition to political weight. Suddenly, Moscow wasn't just another principality. It was becoming the heart of Rus. Still, the rivalry burned on. Throughout the 14th century, Tver and Moscow clashed repeatedly, sometimes in open battle, other times through court intrigue at the Horde's capital of Sarai. Each side sought the coveted title of Grand Prince. At times, the Khans switched their support between the two, keeping both off balance. For the ordinary people of Rus, it meant uncertainty which prince would demand their allegiance tomorrow. By the late 1400s, though, the outcome was clear. Moscow's careful mix of diplomacy, wealth, and steady expansion tipped the scales. When Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow defeated the Mongols at Kulikovo in 1380, even though the Horde later retaliated, it was a symbolic victory that raised Moscow's prestige above all rivals. Tver simply could not compete with that momentum. The struggle between Moscow and Tver was more than a rivalry between two cities. It was the story of how power shifted in Rus, how one principality's pragmatism and patience outlasted another's bold defiance. Without Moscow's rise, there would have been no unified Russia. Without Tver's challenge, Moscow's triumph would not have been so hard-earned. In the end, Moscow claimed the crown, but the contest carved the path that shaped the destiny of all Rus. Dmitry Donskoy and the Battle of Kulikovo. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. Two massive armies standing face to face on a misty morning, the air heavy with silence before the storm. On one side, the Mongol Tatar forces, who had dominated Rus for over a century. On the other, a young prince of Moscow named Dmitry, not yet 30 years old, daring to do what no one before him had truly accomplished: challenge the Horde in open battle. That moment, in the year 1380, on the fields of Kulikovo, became a turning point in Russian history. To understand why this battle mattered so much, you have to picture what life under the Mongol yoke was like. Since the devastating invasion of the 13th century, Rus princes had paid tribute to the Khans of the Golden Horde. If a prince wanted to rule, he needed the Khan's approval. Armies could be raised, churches could be built, but always under the shadow of Mongol power. Most rulers accepted this arrangement, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes willingly, to keep their lands safe. But Dmitry of Moscow, later called Donskoy, saw things differently. He had come to power in the year 1359, inheriting the Principality of Moscow at just 9 years old. Through careful alliances, marriage ties, and bold decisions, Dmitry strengthened Moscow's influence. By the time he was grown, he had managed to build unity among rival Rus princes, who usually spent more time fighting each other than resisting outsiders. That alone was a remarkable achievement. Remember how divided the Rus had been after the age of Yaroslav the Wise? Dmitry was trying to stitch those fragments back together. The Golden Horde at this time wasn't the unstoppable force it had once been. Internal conflicts and rival claimants to the throne weakened it, and Dmitry saw his chance. In 1380, the Mongol commander Mamai marched with a massive army to reassert dominance. Dmitry gathered forces from across Rus, forming an army far larger than Moscow alone could have mustered. Men came from distant principalities, driven by a rare sense of unity and the hope of shaking off foreign control. On September 8, 1380, the two armies met at Kulikovo field, near the Don River. That's why Dmitry earned the name Donskoy, meaning of the Don. The battle began with a dramatic clash of champions. The Russian monk, warrior Tver, rode out to face the Tatar champion Chelubey. They charged, lances lowered, and struck each other dead in a single, thunderous impact. Imagine how both armies must have gasped, seeing neither man rise, a chilling omen of the blood to come. Then the full armies collided. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and lasted for hours. At one point it seemed the Rus lines would break. But Dmitry had hidden a reserve force in a nearby grove under Prince Vladimir Superpower and Dmitry Bobrok. At the decisive moment, this force charged into the Mongol flank, turning the tide. Exhausted and battered, Mamai's army collapsed, fleeing the battlefield. For the first time in living memory, a Rus army had defeated the Mongols in open combat. The victory was stunning, but it didn't end Mongol rule overnight. Within 2 years, the Horde retaliated, and Rus princes were forced to submit again. Yet Kulikovo was different. It planted a seed, the idea that Mongol domination wasn't eternal, that unity could break the yoke. Dmitry became a symbol of resistance, a hero whose courage inspired future generations. When we later talk about Ivan the Great finally throwing off Mongol control, remember Kulikovo, because that triumph would have been unthinkable without Dmitry's daring stand. Still, Dmitry paid a price. His lands were ravaged in revenge, and Moscow itself was burned. But legends grew around him, calling him not just a prince, but a defender of the faith, a protector of the Rus people. The image of the young prince fighting among his soldiers on that misty battlefield endured long after his death in 1389. Kulikovo wasn't just a military clash. It was a moment of awakening. It showed the fractured Rus that they could stand together, that the Mongol shadow could be challenged. And at the center of it all stood Dmitry Donskoy, remembered forever as the man who first dared to strike back. The decline of Mongol power and Moscow's growing independence. Imagine living under a shadow so vast it seemed endless. For more than 200 years, the princes of Rus bowed to Mongol Khans, sending gold, furs, and even soldiers as tribute. The yoke felt permanent, like chains that could never be broken. But shadows don't last forever. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the great Mongol grip began to loosen, and a new power quietly rose in the forests and rivers Moscow. At first, it seemed unlikely. Moscow was just one of many small towns, hardly the wealthiest or strongest. Kiev had the glory of the past, Novgorod the riches of trade, and Tver the ambition of rival princes. Yet Moscow had something special. Clever rulers who knew when to bend and when to strike. They mastered the art of patience, paying tribute faithfully while carefully expanding their influence. The Mongol Empire itself was weakening. Remember how vast it was? From China to Hungary, it stretched across continents. But empires that wide eventually tear at the seams. Different khanates began quarreling, each with its own ambitions. The Golden Horde, which ruled over Rus, faced civil wars, rival claimants to power, and the rising pressure of enemies on its borders. The once terrifying cavalry of the steppe no longer rode with the same unity or fearsome strength. Moscow's princes seized their chance. Ivan Kalita, known as Moneybag, became the Mongols' loyal collector of tribute, a role that gave Moscow wealth and leverage. With that silver, Moscow built stone walls, churches, and alliances. The city grew, not just in strength, but in prestige. The Orthodox Church moved its seat to Moscow, making it the spiritual heart of Rus. Faith and politics intertwined, and suddenly this small town stood at the center of both. But the real shift came with open defiance. In the late 14th century, Dmitry Donskoy led the Muscovite army against the Mongols at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. Though technically still under Mongol rule afterward, the battle became a symbol of hope. It showed that the Mongols could be beaten, that their aura of invincibility was cracking. The victory echoed through generations, inspiring courage even when tribute still had to be paid. Over the next decades, Moscow's influence spread like ripples in water. Other towns and princes, weary of Mongol dominance and constant rivalries, began rallying around Moscow. The princes of Moscow positioned themselves as defenders of the Rusland, protectors of the Orthodox faith, and the ones who could finally bring unity. By the time Ivan III came to power in the late 15th century, Moscow was ready to take the final step. In 1480, he stood against the Mongols at the Ugra River. No great battle was fought. Both sides glared across the river until the Mongols simply withdrew. It was an anticlimactic end to centuries of domination, yet it marked the true breaking of the yoke. Rus was no longer a vassal, and Moscow stood as its leader. This turning point reshaped everything. The fall of Mongol power didn't just free the land, it gave Moscow the chance to redefine what Rus could be. The city that had once seemed insignificant was now the heart of a new power, a place from which future Tsars would claim to inherit not only Rus, but even the legacy of Rome itself. So, from patient tribute payers to bold challengers, the story of Moscow's rise is inseparable from the decline of Mongol might. One empire's fading shadow became another's dawn, and the quiet forests around Moscow would soon echo with the footsteps of an emerging empire. Ivan III, the Great, breaking free from the Horde. Picture a tense standoff on the banks of the Ugra River in the year 1480. On one side, the forces of Moscow led by Grand Prince Ivan III. On the other, the army of the Golden Horde, the Mongol overlords who had dominated Rus lands for over 2 centuries. Both armies glare at each other across the water, neither willing to make the first move. And then, nothing. No battle. No clash of swords. Instead, the Mongols retreat, and with that quiet step backward, centuries of domination come to an end. This is the moment Ivan earned his title, the Great. To understand how Ivan reached this point, we need to go back. Since the mid-13th century, the Mongols had ruled Rus through the Golden Horde. Princes were forced to kneel, to beg for confirmation of their titles, and to send heavy tribute. For generations, it was the price of survival. The Khans in their distant steppe capitals did not govern the daily life of the Rus directly, but their presence loomed over everything. A prince who defied the Horde risked having his city burned to ashes. This system created a strange balance. Local rulers maintained their thrones, but always at the pleasure of foreign conquerors. It was a humiliation remembered for generations. Yet as time passed, the Horde itself grew weaker. The once fearsome Mongol war machine fractured. Civil wars broke out among rival claimants to the throne of the Khan. New nomadic powers rose on the steppe, and the Golden Horde's grip on the western frontiers loosened. Even neighbours like the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the rising Kingdom of Poland pressed into formerly Horde-controlled territories. By the late 14th century, the Horde was not the unstoppable force it had once been under Genghis Khan's descendants. For the princes of Rus, this decline opened a door. The yoke that had seemed permanent now showed cracks. Ivan III of Moscow, who came to power in 1462, saw his chance. He wasn't a warrior in the wild Viking sense of old Rus princes, charging headlong into battle. He was something different, patient, calculating, and politically ruthless. He understood that the Mongols had once beaten Rus because the land was divided. If he could unite it, Moscow could stand on equal footing with anyone. Ivan worked tirelessly to expand his domain, and he did so through every method available: war when necessary, but also diplomacy, clever marriages, and the quiet purchase of neighbouring territories. Bit by bit, he swallowed rival principalities, until Moscow was no longer just one city among many. It was becoming the heart of a new political order. One of Ivan's most brilliant moves was his marriage to Sophia Paleologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome itself, was gone. But through Sophia, Ivan claimed its legacy. He styled Moscow as the Third Rome, the rightful successor to the glory of the Caesars and the Christian Empire of the East. This was more than symbolic. By marrying Sophia, Ivan connected Moscow to the wider Christian world and placed himself on equal footing with European monarchs. He began to adopt imperial rituals, court culture, and even architectural styles borrowed from Byzantium. The Mongols might still demand tribute, but Ivan was sending a clear message. Moscow was not a vassal city. It was the center of a new empire. Ivan's ambitions soon became visible on the map. He annexed Novgorod in 1478 after a brutal campaign. Novgorod had long been a proud republic, with traditions of merchant councils and relative independence. Ivan crushed these freedoms, executed many of the city's leaders, and resettled its population to prevent further resistance. By doing so, he brought Novgorod's vast northern lands, forests, and trade routes under Moscow's control. It was a decisive step in turning Moscow from a regional principality into the dominant power of Rus. The message was unmistakable. The age of independent city-states was over. By the late 1470s, Ivan felt strong enough to challenge the Horde openly. He stopped sending tribute, a bold, even dangerous move that no prince before him had dared sustain for long. The Khan of the Horde, Ahmed, marched west to enforce his authority, and the confrontation led to the Ugra standoff in 1480. Chronicles describe the eerie tension of those days. Two armies camped on opposite banks, watching, waiting, sometimes firing arrows, but never crossing the river. It was as if both sides sensed that history itself balanced on a knife's edge. In the end, Ahmed withdrew. Whether it was fear of battle, trouble back in his own lands, or simply the recognition that the old order had slipped away, his retreat became the symbolic end of Mongol domination. To the people of Rus, it was as though the centuries-long Tatar yoke had been cast off in silence. This triumph wasn't just about foreign control. Ivan used his victory to tighten his grip at home. He worked to centralize power in Moscow, reducing the independence of the boyars, the old noble families who had once been nearly as powerful as princes themselves. Their authority was absorbed into the state, their lands tied more directly to service under the Grand Prince. Ivan's policies laid the foundations for autocracy, the idea that all authority flowed from the ruler. This was a dramatic change from the fractured politics of earlier centuries, and Ivan thought big, both in symbols and in stone. He rebuilt the Kremlin in white stone and brick, hiring Italian Renaissance architects to create the towers, cathedrals, and walls that still dominate Moscow today. Within its walls, the Cathedral of the Dormition became the spiritual heart of the state, where princes would be crowned and rulers buried. He adopted the double-headed eagle as his emblem, a symbol once used by Byzantium, now reimagined to link Moscow's destiny with both East and West. These were not the gestures of a provincial prince. They were the deliberate choices of a man who saw Moscow as the capital of an empire in the making. Ivan's reign was not without struggles. His wars with Lithuania and Livonia were long and costly, and his harsh suppression of Novgorod earned him fear as well as respect. Family conflicts troubled his later years, including bitter disputes over the succession. But even these difficulties did not overshadow the scale of what he accomplished. When Ivan died in 1505, Moscow was no longer a modest principality bowing to Mongol Khans. It had become the nucleus of a powerful, centralized state, poised to expand further in the centuries ahead. So when we think of Ivan the Great, it isn't just the silent victory on the Ugra River that matters. It's the transformation he set in motion, the unification of Rus lands, the creation of a centralized authority, the claiming of imperial traditions, and the building of a capital meant to endure. The Mongols had cast their shadow for generations, shaping the destiny of Rus. But under Ivan, Moscow stepped into the light, laying the foundation for the Russia that would one day stretch across continents. His reign closed one chapter of subjugation and opened another, the rise of a state with ambitions as vast as its lands, the fall of Constantinople and Moscow as the Third Rome. Imagine the shock across Christendom in the year 1453. The mighty walls of Constantinople, which had stood for more than 1,000 years, finally crumbled under the cannons of the Ottoman Turks. The city that had once been the shining jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the Second Rome, was gone. For the people of Rus, this wasn't just distant news, it was an earthquake that shook their entire sense of identity. If Constantinople, the center of their spiritual world, had fallen, what did that mean for them? From the time of Vladimir's baptism centuries earlier, when he brought Christianity to Kiev and Rus, the princes of Rus and later Moscow had looked to Byzantium as their guiding star. The Orthodox faith, the liturgy sung in their churches, the shimmering icons, even the domes that crowned their cathedrals, all had been inherited from Byzantium. Constantinople was more than a city. It was the mother church, the symbol of Christian civilization, the place where heaven seemed to touch earth. Pilgrims, priests, and envoys from Rus travelled there, returned with treasures, and carried back stories of its vast Hagia Sophia, its imperial court, its wealth and glory. To them, Byzantium was the model of what a Christian empire could be, and now it was in the hands of the Ottomans. In the vacuum left behind, Moscow began to see itself differently. For a long time, Rus had been politically fragmented, scarred by Mongol domination and rivalries between principalities. But spiritually, it had always looked south to Constantinople. With that anchor gone, the mantle of responsibility seemed to drift northward. Its rulers, especially Ivan III, started to claim that they were the heirs to Byzantium's legacy. If Rome had been the first great Christian empire, and Constantinople the second, then Moscow would be the third, the final Rome. Two Romes have fallen. A monk named Philotheus of Pskov famously declared, "The third stands, and there will not be a fourth." Those words echoed in the hearts of Moscow's princes, who began to weave destiny itself into their authority. This was more than just a spiritual claim, it was also a bold political move. Ivan III married Sophia Palaiologina, the niece of Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor who had died defending Constantinople. Through Sophia, Ivan gained a direct link to the fallen imperial dynasty. It was as if he had grafted Moscow onto the ancient tree of Roman and Byzantine legitimacy. Suddenly, Moscow was not just another principality among many, nor merely a tributary still shadowed by Mongol power. It was presenting itself as the rightful center of Orthodox Christianity, the new beacon of faith for a world that felt shaken and uncertain after the loss of Constantinople. Symbols reinforced this shift. The double-headed eagle, once emblazoned on Byzantine standards, was adopted by Moscow. One head looked east, the other west, a powerful declaration that Moscow's influence and duty extended across the horizon. Within the city itself, churches became grander. The onion domes rose higher, painted in brilliant colors and glittering with crosses, their forms designed to stand out against the sky as visible signs of divine protection. Icons were painted with greater intricacy, emphasizing not just beauty but theology, telling ordinary believers that they lived in the city chosen by idol. Even the rebuilding of the Kremlin under Ivan's reign was steeped in this new identity. A fortress not only of stone, but of spiritual authority. Yet this identity as the Third Rome was not built overnight. It grew out of centuries of struggle and slow consolidation. Ivan I, called Kalita, had laid the groundwork in the 14th century by carefully cooperating with the Mongols, collecting tribute for them, and using that position to strengthen Moscow's wealth and standing. Dmitry Donskoy, a century later, had given Rus a taste of defiance when he defeated Mongol forces at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. That victory had not ended Mongol dominance, but it had planted the idea that resistance was possible. Each generation added to this foundation, and by the time Constantinople fell, Moscow was ready to step forward and claim a larger role. The loss of the Byzantine capital was not the end of a story for Rus, it was the catalyst for a new beginning. For the common people, the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome gave meaning to their hardships. Generations had endured the humiliation of the Mongol yoke, seen their towns burned, and lived through endless wars between rival princes. Now they were told that their sacrifices were part of a divine plan. They were not merely surviving, they were citizens of the city chosen to carry forward the torch of true faith. This sense of destiny seeped into Russian culture, shaping its chronicles, its prayers, and its songs. It also became a powerful tool for rulers, who could now claim that obedience to Moscow was not just political loyalty, but spiritual duty. Of course, this vision carried heavy consequences. To believe that Moscow was the Third Rome was to believe it had a mission, a sacred responsibility to protect orthodoxy and expand its reach. This meant wars against neighbors who threatened Orthodox believers, campaigns to bring other lands into Moscow's fold, and a justification for autocracy at home. Later rulers, especially the Tsars, would lean on this idea to defend their authority, portraying themselves not only as kings, but as idols chosen guardians of the true faith. The fall of Constantinople had shifted the balance of the Christian world, and Moscow eagerly stepped into the role of savior and successor. So when you picture that moment in 1453, don't just imagine the Ottoman banners flying over Constantinople's battered walls. See the ripples spreading outward across Europe, reaching the forests and rivers of Rus. Imagine the shock, the grief, but also the sudden realization in a distant city on the Moscow River that they, perhaps alone, could carry forward the light of orthodoxy. Out of Byzantium's ashes rose a new identity, one that would define Russian history for centuries. Moscow, the Third Rome, the city chosen by idol, the city that would never fall, at least, so its rulers believed. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar and his ruthless reign. Picture a child crowned with power before he could even understand it. At just 3 years old, Ivan IV became Grand Prince of Moscow after his father's death in 1533. His childhood was not one of warmth or guidance, but of fear and neglect. Powerful boyar families, hungry for influence, ruled in his name, often abusing and humiliating the young prince. Imagine growing up in a palace where the very people meant to protect you instead treated you like a pawn. Ivan witnessed violence, betrayals, and cruelty at an age when most children should have been sheltered. That early bitterness and mistrust sank deep into him and would shape his entire life and reign. When he finally seized full control, Ivan wasted no time in transforming his rule. In 1547, at just 16, he declared himself Tsar of all Rus. This was more than a title change. Tsar came from Caesar, linking Moscow to the legacies of Rome and Byzantium. By adopting it, Ivan was making a bold statement. He wasn't just another prince among many. He was an emperor, chosen by idol to rule a unified and sacred empire. That shift laid the foundation for Russia's autocracy, projecting an image of absolute power that would become the hallmark of Russian monarchy. At first, Ivan's reign showed great promise. He moved with remarkable energy, reforming the army and creating a permanent force called the Streltsy, armed with firearms at a time when most armies still relied heavily on bows and melee weapons. He introduced a new legal code in 1550, which helped standardize justice across his growing state. He also created the Zemsky Soba, an assembly that brought together nobles, clergy, and townsmen, giving the impression of wider consultation while ultimately strengthening his authority. These reforms made Moscow's government more centralized and more effective, allowing Ivan to project power farther than any of his predecessors. Ivan also pushed Russia outward, driven by both ambition and faith. His armies marched eastward, defeating the Tatar Khanate of Kazan in 1552 and Astrakhan in 1556. These victories were celebrated as holy wars, triumphs of orthodoxy over Islam, and they dramatically expanded Russian territory. With the Volga River now under Moscow's control, Russia secured access to rich lands, trade routes, and new populations. Church bells rang, hymns were sung, and Ivan was hailed as a hero. For a time, it seemed he might be remembered alongside the greatest rulers of Europe, a builder of empire and defender of faith. But power mixed with paranoia is a dangerous thing. Ivan's reign took a darker turn after personal tragedies struck. In 1560, his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, suddenly died. Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned by the boyars, his lifelong rivals. Whether true or not, the loss shattered him. His grief hardened into rage, and from that moment his suspicion deepened into obsession. He saw plots everywhere, treachery in every noble family, and enemies even in his closest circle. Out of this paranoia came the creation of the Oprichnina in 1565. Ivan carved the country into two parts, the regular state and the Oprichnina, a domain under his personal rule. The Oprichniki, his fearsome enforcers, dressed in black and rode black horses. They carried grotesque symbols, dogs' heads to sniff out betrayal, and brooms to sweep it away. But their real mission was terror. They confiscated land, executed nobles, and massacred entire communities accused of disloyalty. In 1570, Ivan turned his fury on Novgorod, a once proud city suspected of treason. Thousands of its citizens were tortured and killed in a campaign of horror. The massacre shocked even contemporaries, leaving behind ruins and corpses where a vibrant city had stood. Ivan's cruelty was not limited to his enemies. His fits of rage grew more violent over time. In 1581, during a heated argument with his son and heir, also named Ivan, the Tsar struck him with his staff. The blow proved fatal. The image of the Tsar cradling his dying son, filled with anguish over what he had done, became one of the most haunting and tragic scenes in Russian history. The act left Russia without a strong successor, destabilizing the dynasty at the very moment it needed stability. And yet, Ivan was not simply a tyrant consumed by madness. His reign also carried vision. Under his rule, Russia began pushing into Siberia, thanks in part to the daring expeditions of Cossack leaders like Yermak Timofeyevich. These campaigns opened vast territories that would later make Russia the largest country in the world. Ivan also encouraged cultural growth. Printing presses appeared in Moscow, new churches were built, and the iconic St. Basil's Cathedral was constructed on Red Square to commemorate the conquest of Kazan. Its colourful domes still stand today as a symbol of his era. But the paradox of Ivan's reign was that his vision was always accompanied by violence. He centralized power in ways that strengthened the state but also hollowed out society. The boyars were broken, towns were devastated, and the population lived in fear. His wars with Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden dragged on, draining resources and leaving Russia exhausted. By the time Ivan died in 1584, he left behind a country that was larger and more centralized, but also scarred, weakened, and leaderless. His death plunged Russia into the time of troubles, a period of famine, foreign invasion, and civil war that nearly destroyed the state he had built. To understand Russia's later rulers, from Peter the Great to Stalin, you have to understand Ivan. He was the first Tsar, the man who shaped the image of Russian autocracy with equal parts triumph and terror. His victories expanded Russia's horizons, his reforms modernized its institutions, but his cruelty scarred its people and destabilized its dynasty. Ivan the Terrible carved the Russian crown out of blood and iron, and in doing so, he set the stage for centuries of rule by fear and absolute power, from medieval principality to emerging Russian empire. A land broken into many small parts, each ruled by different princes, always pulling against each other. That was Rus, after the Mongol invasions, divided, vulnerable, and bound together only loosely by memory and faith. Cities like Novgorod, Tver, Ryazan, and Moscow each had their own rulers, jealous of one another and desperate for survival. Some submitted willingly to the Khans of the Golden Horde, others resisted when they could, but all lived under the shadow of tribute and destruction. For 2 centuries, Rus was not a single country but a fractured collection of principalities, tied only by their shared Orthodox faith and their memory of what Kievan Rus had once been. Yet slowly, over generations, those fragments began to gather under a single thread. By the end of the 15th century, the quilt was no longer a fragile collection of patches. It was becoming a cloak, draped over a prince who would soon call himself not just a ruler of a city, but a sovereign of an empire. The story begins with Moscow, a principality that, in the early days, was little more than another contender among many. Founded in the 12th century as a relatively minor settlement on the Moskva River, Moscow's rise seemed unlikely at first. But fortune favored its location near key trade routes and deep enough in the forests to provide protection from steppe raiders. Clever princes used marriage alliances, calculated loyalty to the Horde, and the wealth from collecting tribute to build their power. Over time, Moscow's influence spread outward, swallowing smaller territories and forging bonds with the Orthodox Church, which gradually shifted its seat of authority from Kiev to Vladimir and then to Moscow. That partnership between throne and altar gave the city a sacred aura that other principalities could not match. Dmitry Donskoy's victory at Kulikovo in 1380 gave Moscow prestige as the defender of the people. Even if Mongol power lingered, the battle itself was bloody and not decisive enough to end Mongol dominance, but it showed that the Horde was not invincible. For the first time in generations, Rus could imagine itself standing against its overlords. That prestige mattered, because it helped Moscow attract allies and vassals who were tired of bowing to outsiders. Dmitry's victory became a legend, told and retold in chronicles and songs, laying moral groundwork for Moscow's leadership. The real turning point came with Ivan III, often called Ivan the Great. When he took the throne in the year 1462, Moscow was already influential, but he transformed it into something much larger. He skillfully maneuvered against rival powers, expanding his territory through marriage, purchase, and war. He refused to acknowledge the dominance of the Golden Horde, and in 1480, at the stand on the Ugra River, he faced down the Khan's army. No battle was fought. Instead, the Mongols retreated. It may not have been as dramatic as Kulikovo, but symbolically, it marked the end of 2 centuries of Mongol rule. Chroniclers saw it as a quiet miracle, the moment when Rus finally lifted the Tatar yoke. Ivan didn't stop there. He expanded Moscow's reach, annexing Novgorod in 1478. Remember Novgorod's proud republic, ringing its Vesh bell to summon its citizens for debate. Under Ivan, that independence ended. The Vesh bell was silenced, shipped to Moscow as a symbol of submission. The city's vast lands, stretching all the way to the Arctic, and its rich trade wealth with Europe now flowed into Moscow's orbit. It was a bold statement. No more semi-independent cities, no more fragmented principalities. All would bow to the Grand Prince. At the same time, Ivan wrapped Moscow in a new identity. He married Sophia Palaeologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. And with that union came powerful symbolism. He adopted the double-headed eagle as his emblem, a sign that Moscow now saw itself as the Third Rome, the heir to both the Christian Empire of Byzantium and the legacy of Rome itself. Can you imagine the pride this must have inspired in a land that had long been under foreign domination? For ordinary people, The idea that their ruler was now connected to the fallen empire of Constantinople gave them a sense of living in a city chosen by idol to lead the Christian world. Inside Moscow, Ivan also built a stage worthy of his ambitions. The Kremlin was transformed into a fortress palace, its wooden walls replaced by stone. Italian architects were invited to design its cathedrals and towers, blending Russian tradition with Renaissance skill. Travelers arriving in the city would have been awestruck by its white stone walls and golden domes glinting in the sun. This was no longer just another Rus principality. It looked and felt like the seat of a new power, radiating wealth, faith, and authority. Of course, power rarely expands without conflict. Ivan's reign was marked by wars with Lithuania, Tver, and the remnants of the Horde. He tested his strength constantly against neighbours, and each conflict seemed to confirm Moscow's resilience. Even when victories were incomplete, Moscow's prestige grew. By the time of his death in 1505, Ivan had more than tripled his territory. His title, Sovereign of all Rus, wasn't just a boast, it was becoming a reality. The political map of northeastern Europe had shifted, and at its centre stood Moscow, no longer provincial but imperial in ambition. But perhaps the most important shift wasn't just in land or wealth, but in mindset. The people of Moscow began to see themselves not as subjects of a local prince, but as citizens of something greater, something enduring. A Muscovite might once have thought of himself as simply from Novgorod, Ryazan, or Tver. Now, more and more, people thought of themselves as part of a single Rus under a single ruler. The idea of a Russian state, central and unified, had taken root. That psychological shift was just as significant as any battle won or tower built. When we later reach the reign of Ivan the Terrible, you'll see how this foundation was both a blessing and a curse, a springboard to empire, but also a stage for tyranny. Yet it all began here, in the transformation of Moscow from a medieval principality into the heart of an emerging Russian empire. For the first time, the pieces of that patchwork quilt were stitched tightly together, forming not just a cloak for one prince, but the beginnings of a nation that would soon command the stage of world history. And that was the sweeping tale of medieval Russia, from scattered Slavic tribes to the thunder of Mongol hooves, and finally to the rise of Tsars who would shape an empire. A story of resilience, ambition, and transformation that laid the foundation for everything Russia would become. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like the video, drop a comment with your favorite part, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in the epic story of civilizations.